What's up you guys? So in this video I'm going to be sharing with you everything that I do to set up LSP from scratch in Neovim to get really nice auto-completion, diagnostics, and all of the different features that LSP has to offer for working with different programming languages within Neovim. I've already gone through this process in my previous Neovim complete setup guide, but I wanted to make an updated video on this as my config has seen some changes over time, and I wanted to make a video specifically focused on this topic as it can be one of the more challenging aspects of setting up Neovim, especially when you're first starting out. I'll have a link in the description to my current entire Neovim config so you can take a look at my setup and also use it for reference. With that said, let's get started. Alright, so I've opened up my Neovim config here. This file you're looking at here is the primary init.lua file, which Neovim looks at whenever it starts. This first line here loads Hosyan.core, which is under the Lua folder, under Hosyan and core. This essentially configures some basic options and keymaps for my config. And then this second line requires Hosyan.lazy, which corresponds to this lazy.lua file you see here on the left hand side. If you haven't watched my previous video on how to set up and use lazy.nvim for managing and installing all of your Neovim plugins, I would highly recommend you watch that before moving on with this video so you'll have a better understanding as to everything that's going on. If you're using a different plugin manager instead, then you can adapt whatever I'm sharing here on this video to the plugin manager you prefer. Alright, so let's open up this lazy.lua file. If you've seen my previous video on lazy.nvim, then you'll know that this first block of code bootstrap lazy so that Neovim will install it if it isn't already installed. And then this code right here will require and load lazy and then call the setup function. And the first argument here is the Hosyan.plugins module. You'll see this on the left hand side right here. I'm going to open this directory and it's basically a list of all of the different plugins that I'm using with my config. It's one of the reasons I like using lazy.nvim because it allows me to easily organize my plugins in a nice way. And then the second argument is just a table with several different options that I use to configure lazy.nvim. So let's add the first plugin that I've been using lately for working with LSP, and that's Telescope. Telescope is a really nice fuzzy finder for Neovim. You can use it to navigate files within your project, look for strings of text, but you can also use it in conjunction with Neovim's LSP functionality. So that's why we're gonna need it for this particular setup. Alright, so I'm gonna go here to the File Explorer, and I'm gonna add a new file under this folder by pressing A, which is a built-in keymap for nvim tree. And I'm gonna call this file telescope.lua and press enter to open it. I'm gonna close the File Explorer with a custom keymap that I have for that, which is leader EE. And then the first thing we want to do here is return a table, which will have all of the information that lazy.nvim needs to install Telescope and configure it. The first thing that we need to add here is the short plugin URL for Telescope. You can find this in the telescope.nvim repository or in the code that I'll have linked in the description for you to have as reference for this video. Then according to the Telescope documentation, we need to add the following here so that we use the Telescope release branch. Then we need to add a couple of dependencies that Telescope will need. The first one is called Plenary, which is just some Lua functions that Telescope needs. Then we want to add the following, which will improve Telescope's sorting performance. In case you're wondering, all of this I found from their documentation. And then we want to add the following, which will add dev icons for Telescope. After adding the dependencies, we want to add a config function here, which will run whenever this plugin loads. In this case, because we're not doing any lazy loading, Telescope will load whenever Neovim starts, and this config function will run at that time. Now we need to add local telescope equals require telescope so that we can load it. I also want to add telescope actions to configure some keymaps. So I'm going to go do the following. All right, and then I want to add the following here. So we're going to call the telescope setup function. And then to this setup function, we're going to add a table. And inside of that, we're going to add the following. Under this default property, we're going to have this mappings property, which we'll use to set up some custom keymaps for Telescope. This specifies that these keymaps will be in insert mode. And then you'll see here that I've configured Ctrl+k to go up a Telescope result, Ctrl+j to go down, and then Ctrl+q to send selected Telescope results to the quick fix list. And then after this setup function, we want to add the following so that we can load the FCF extension And then after loading this extension, which again will improve the telescope sorting performance, we want to add the following, which is a set of custom key maps to trigger different telescope actions. Down here we set our key maps. This first one, leader FF, will find files in the current working directory. The second one will find recent files we've opened. This third one will look for a given string in the current working directory. And this fourth one will look for the string under the cursor in the current working directory. All right, let's save this file with :W and enter. There's one more thing we're going to have to do here for Telescope to work properly, and that is to install ripgrep. So to install it, I'm going to exit out of Neovim with :Q and enter. And you can run brew install ripgrep to install ripgrep on your MacBook if you're using Homebrew. I'm going to have a link in the description to the ripgrep repository so you can look for what you need to install it if you're on a different machine or using another package manager. I already have it installed, so I'm not going to run this. Let's go back into Neovim by doing nvim and pressing enter. And you'll see here that Lazy automatically will notice that we're missing the telescope and telescope FCF native plugins, and we'll go ahead and install them. Now you can close the lazy.nvim UI by pressing Q, and then we can test out the key maps we configured for telescope. So I can do leader FF, which in my case is space FF, and that will look up files in the current working directory. You'll see those here. I'm going to decrease the font size here so you can see how file previews work. I'm going to open telescope again with space FF, and you'll see that if telescope has enough space, then it'll show you file previews on the right hand side. If I start typing a file name here, you'll see that telescope will look for it. To close telescope, you can do Ctrl+C. Awesome, so telescope is working properly. You'll be seeing more of telescope as we continue to set up LSP on this config. Now that we've finished setting up telescope, the next plugin that we want to install is called dressing.nvim. Essentially what this plugin does is improve the UI for two built-in Neovim functions, and those are vim.ui.select and vim.ui.input. If I write here :h and vim.ui.select to open the help page, you'll see that this function prompts the user to pick from a list of items. And if I do :h vim.ui.input, this other function prompts the user for input. I'm going to run these so you can see an example of how they work. I'm going to do that with : and then typing out Lua to execute Lua code. Then I'm going to do vim.ui.input. The first thing that gets passed here is a table, and the property we'll define here is called prompt. Assign this to enter input. Then I'm going to close this table as the first argument, and then we're going to add a callback function for what we want to do with this input. In this case, let's just print it out and end the function. I'm going to close this call to vim.ui.input. You'll see here that if I press enter, it'll ask me for an input. I'm just going to say hi, and if I press enter again, it'll execute the function, which will print it out. Now let's show you how vim.ui.select works. I'm going to execute Lua code again. I'm going to do vim.ui.select. The first thing to pass here is a set of options in a table. So this is going to be 1 and 2. And then a table of options, I'm going to leave this empty. And then a function for what we're going to do with the selection. So I just want to print the selection out. End this function and close this call. I'm going to press enter. It's asking us to select 1 or 2. I'm going to type out 1 and press enter to select the first option, and that just prints it out. So these functions get called when doing several different things in Neovim, including LSP specific functionality like selecting from a list of code actions or doing a smart rename of a variable or a function. So that's why we want to improve this UI with dressing.nvim. Let's install the plugin by going over to the File Explorer. I'm going to go to Plugins, and I'm going to press A, which is the nvim tree key map for adding a file, and I'm going to call this dressing.lua. I'm going to press enter to open this file. We're going to return a table. Now it should be pretty simple. We're going to add this short plugin URL for dressing.nvim, and then we're going to do lazy loading for this plugin. It's going to lazy load on an event, and this is a special event called very lazy, which tells lazy.nvim to load this plugin later, and it's not important for the initial UI. All right, let's save this. I'm going to open the lazy UI with :lazy. You'll see here that it specifies dressing.nvim as not installed. So let's install it with capital I. Let's close the UI with Q. Now I'm going to manually load this plugin so that we don't have to exit and re-enter back into Neovim with lazy load and dressing.nvim. Awesome. You'll see now that if I execute one of the functions we did earlier, so I'm going to do : and then I'm going to press the up arrow to look for one of these again. This is the vim.ui.select function. If I press enter, you'll see that it'll now default to using telescope to ask us to choose one of these options, and I can use Ctrl+j and Ctrl+k to go through them as we've configured in telescope. And if I press enter, it'll just print it out. Pretty cool, right? So this will come in handy when we're working with LSP code actions. For example, you'll see this in a little bit as we go through setting up LSP. So now I'm going to execute the vim.ui.input function so you guys can see that. I'm going to do : and up arrow to go up on commands I've already executed. Where is it? Oh, there it is. And if I press enter, you'll see that now I have an input box here. The callback function will just print it out. So I'm just going to type out hello world here, press enter, and you'll see that it'll print it out in the bottom. So that'll come in handy when we're going to rename a variable with LSP, for example. This also works with nvim tree. So for example, if I need to rename a file here, which in nvim tree you do by typing out R, it'll ask me for the new file name with the improved UI as well. I'm going to close that with Ctrl+C. Alright, so there's one final plugin that I want to configure first before we dive into LSP specific stuff, and that's nvim-cmp, which we'll be using for completion in Neovim. Again, I'm going to add a new file by typing A, and I'm going to call this nvim-cmp.lua. I'm going to open this file, close the file explorer. All right, so the first thing we want to do here is return a table, and then the first property here will be the short plugin URL for nvim-cmp. We're going to load nvim-cmp on an event, and that's insert enter. That means that this plugin will only load whenever we go into insert mode in Neovim. And then we're going to add a list of dependencies for nvim-cmp. This first one is a plugin which is just a completion source for nvim-cmp. This specific completion source will allow nvim-cmp to recommend text to us that is within the current buffer. And then this other plugin is also a source that will allow us to get recommendations for file system paths. This next one is a snippet engine so that we can also get snippet recommendations in autocompletion. This fourth one is the completion source for these snippets, and this last one is just a set of a lot of useful snippets for many different languages in VS Code format. Alright, next we want to add a config function that will run whenever nvim-cmp loads, so when we go into insert mode. And then I want to add this require statement to load nvim-cmp. And then I also want to add this other require statement to load LuaSnip, which is the snippet engine. And then this other line will load any VS Code style snippets that we've installed from plugins. So in this case, it will load all of these snippets from the Friendly Snippets plugin. Then we want to call the setup function for nvim-cmp. And then inside of this, the first thing I'm going to add is the following so that we can configure how the completion menu works. To find more information about this, you can look for :h complete opt to learn more about the complete opt setting. And then what we want to add next is the following. This will configure how nvim-cmp interacts with the LuaSnip snippet engine. And then we want to add some custom mappings for nvim-cmp. Again, I like using Ctrl+k and Ctrl+j to go up and down the recommendations list, like we do with telescope. I use Ctrl+b and Ctrl+f to go backwards and forwards in the preview window. Ctrl+ will manually open the nvim-cmp recommendations. Ctrl+e will close the recommendations, and pressing enter will confirm a selection. Now finally, we want to add our sources for nvim-cmp. The first one will be the LuaSnip completion source for our snippets. Second one will be text within the buffer, and the last one will be file system paths. Note that the order of these sources does determine the priority of the recommendations. So snippets will show up first, text within the buffer will show up after snippets, and then file system paths will be last. Of course, you can rearrange this according to your preference. So this is the basic configuration I use for nvim-cmp. This will be a great starting point to add LSP to this config as well. Once we configure LSP, we'll also be adding that as a completion source so we can get LSP recommendations as we type as well. I'm gonna save this file. Now I'm gonna open the lazy UI with :lazy, press enter. You'll see here that now lazy.nvim recognizes that it needs to install nvim-cmp and all of the dependencies we listed. Let's go ahead and do that by pressing I. Sweet, I'm gonna close the lazy UI with Q. So I'm gonna manually load the nvim-cmp plugin so that we don't have to exit and go back into Neovim. I'm gonna do :lazy load nvim-cmp and press enter. See now that if I go somewhere in here into insert mode and I start typing, I get some snippet recommendations, I get some text from within the buffer. And if I start typing out a path, so for example, if I do // I'm also gonna get file recommendations, and you'll see those on the right hand side, and I can scroll through them with Ctrl+F to go down and Ctrl+B to go up. Those stand for forwards and backwards. I can exit out of here with Ctrl+E. Now that we've done that and we've configured telescope, dressing.nvim, and nvim-cmp, we're ready to install some language servers and configure them to finish up our LSP configuration. So I'm gonna open up the file explorer. Now I wanna add a folder under plugins that's gonna be called LSP. So I'm gonna do I'm gonna type out LSP and follow that with a / so that nvim tree knows that we wanna add a folder. That'll add the LSP folder under plugins. I'm gonna go back to lazy.lua. I'm gonna open it. Now I need to go down here to hosian.plugins. I need to convert this to a table. And then this will also be a table in here, and it's gonna be import equals to hosian.plugins. Then we're gonna add a second table that's gonna be called import equals hosian.plugins.lsp. Close this out here. That's because the lazy.nvim won't automatically load nested folders within the plugins directory, so I have to specify this. Let's save this file. I'm gonna go back here to the LSP folder. I'm gonna add a new file, and this one is gonna be called mason.lua. Let's open that up. This will install and configure Mason, which I think is the best way to install and manage all of your language servers for Neovim, so that you don't have to do this outside of Neovim, and it's a really nice and convenient way to go about this. I'm gonna close the file explorer. All right, so we need to return a table here, and then the first thing will be the short plugin URL for Mason. Then I'm gonna add some dependencies for Mason. The only dependency that we're gonna need here is called mason-lspconfig. We're gonna be using the nvim-lspconfig plugin in a second to configure all of our language servers. This mason-lsp plugin will basically act as the bridge between Mason and nvim-lspconfig. All right, so the next thing we want to add here is a config function that will run whenever Mason loads. In this case, we're not doing lazy loading, so Mason will load whenever Neovim starts. Then we want to load Mason first, and then we'll load mason-lspconfig. And then what we're gonna do is call the Mason setup function. In this setup function, I'm passing a table with this UI property. I'm just setting some icons here to make the Mason UI look a little nicer. All right, after calling the Mason setup function, we're gonna call the mason-lspconfig setup function as well. Note that this should always be after calling mason.setup. Thing we're gonna do here is define this ensure_installed table, which is basically just a list of language servers that we want Mason to install. This other option here means that if we've configured a server that isn't installed or listed anywhere, then Mason will also install it. This is separate and different from ensure installed. Let's save this file. I'm gonna have to exit out of Neovim here with :Q. I'm gonna open it up again. You'll see that now lazy.nvim has installed mason-lspconfig and mason.nvim. Let's close the UI with Q, and let's open Mason with :Mason. Let's press 2 to go to the LSP section. Note that you can also use Mason to install debug adapters, linters, and formatters. I'm planning on doing a new video on linting and formatting in Neovim with some possible alternatives to null-ls, as null-ls is typically used for linting and formatting, but this plugin has been recently archived and some of you have been asking for an updated video on that. I still haven't migrated from null-ls. I am looking into alternatives, but it's still been working fine for me, at least for now. Alright, so you'll see here that Mason will automatically install any of the language servers that you've listed in the ensure installed list of mason-lspconfig. So that's great. Now we have the language servers that we need installed. Note that a lot of these I use for web development. So I have language servers for CSS, Emmet, HTML, Tailwind CSS, and the TypeScript language server, but this will work for any language server that you need for the language you're working on. I would recommend you look at the list in mason-lspconfig or nvim-lspconfig, which we'll be diving into in a second. All right, let's close this UI with Q. I'm gonna open the File Explorer. I'm gonna go down here to Lua, Halcyon, Plugins. I'm gonna open the LSP directory, and I'm gonna add a new file here called lspconfig.lua. This is where we'll configure all of our language servers. Alright, so again, in this lspconfig file, the first thing we want to do is return a table, and the first property here will be the short plugin URL for nvim-lspconfig. Then we're going to add a table of events. This first event means that we want to load this plugin whenever we open a new buffer for a pre-existing file. And the second one means that we want to also load this plugin when we open a new buffer for a file that doesn't exist. Now we want to specify some dependencies for this plugin. This first dependency is the completion source we're going to be using, so we can have LSP recommendations in our auto completion. And then this second one is one I've been trying recently. It basically allows you to rename files through nvim-tree or neo-tree, which are file explorers, and for language servers that support it, also update any affected import statements. I'll show you guys how this works when we go through some examples. Alright, next we want to have a config function that will run whenever nvim-lspconfig loads. Then we want to load the lspconfig plugin with this require statement. Then we want to load the LSP completion source for nvim-cmp for recommendations as we type. Then I'm going to set this local variable called keymap that we'll use to set up some keymaps for doing LSP operations. And then we're going to define those keymaps. The first thing you see here is just a table of options for the keymaps. Then we define an onAttach function where we'll be defining the keymaps. This will allow us to define a set of keymaps that will only apply when a given language server attaches to a buffer. Now you'll see that for each keymap, I update the description property of the ops table to assign a description for the keymap, and then I define the keymap. And you'll see here, for example, this specific keymap will use telescope to show us all of the LSP references for whatever is under the cursor. You'll see here that for some of these, I'm just using the built-in Neovim LSP function, and for others, I'm using telescope. The second one will take us to the declaration of whatever is under the cursor. This third one will show us any LSP definitions for what's under the cursor. This next one will show us LSP implementations. This one will show us type definitions for what's under the cursor. Again, this one is with telescope. This will open up relevant code actions. This will do a smart rename of what's under the cursor. This will show us any diagnostics for the current buffer with telescope. This will show us the diagnostics for the current line. This will go to the previous closest diagnostic. This will go to the next closest one. Uppercase K will show us the documentation for what is under the cursor. And then I also have leader RS to restart the language servers. This can come in handy from time to time. LSP restart is a command provided by this lspconfig plugin. There are several others. Over here you can do this : or you can change this to CMD as well. Alright, the next thing I want to do is define this local variable called capabilities. This is used to enable auto-completion for our language servers, and we need to assign it to all of our language server configurations. You'll see this in a second. Next, I want to also configure the symbols for diagnostics. So I define the signs table, which will have the icons for errors, warnings, hints, and information. And then in this for loop, I go through this signs table, and this function sets the icon for each of these. All right, now we want to configure our first language server. To do this, I just use this lspconfig variable, which we loaded earlier. That is over here. And we access the name of the server we want to configure. You can take a look at the lspconfig documentation to see a list of example configs for all of the available language servers. Again, you have to have them installed on your machine, and we've already done that with Mason. So if I open Mason and go to LSP, you'll see the HTML LSP server there. And close Mason with Q. And then we define this capabilities so that auto-completion can work properly. And then we assign the onAttach function, which we defined earlier. This is where we define all of our keymaps to this onAttach property, so that whenever the HTML language server attaches to a buffer, the onAttach function will run and the keymaps will get applied. And then you just keep on adding servers here. This one is for the TypeScript server. I used to use typescript.nvim, which is a plugin for this. This plugin has been archived and some of you have been asking me about it, so I just reverted back to the TypeScript language server. Again, I'd recommend you take a look at the nvim-lspconfig repo. It has examples for a ton of different language servers, and you can probably find the ones that you need for your specific use case. A lot of them are pretty simple, and you just have to assign the onAttach function and the capabilities for auto-completion. I also have a config for CSS. I have another one for Tailwind CSS. I also have one for Emmet. In the specific one, I assign this file types property so that it only activates for specific file types. In the documentation, you'll see that a lot of these have a default set of file types, and you can modify this list according to what you need. And I also added this last one for Python. You can use Pyrite, for example. Finally, I also have one for Lua. This is the config for the Lua language server. Again, we assign the capabilities, the onAttach function, and this one has some additional settings. We have to set this diagnostics property so that the language server can recognize the Vim global variable. And we also want to make the language server aware of any runtime files. Alright, let's save this file with :W and enter. Now let's open up the lazy UI with :lazy. You'll see that now it knows that it needs to install these new plugins. We'll press capital I to install them. I'm going to press Q to close this UI. Now there's one final thing we need to do here. Let's open the File Explorer, and I'm going to go to nvim-cmp. I'm going to open this. And in this list of sources, we need to add a new completion source for nvim-cmp. It's going to look like the following. So this new completion source is our LSP, so that we can get those recommendations as we type. Let's save this file with :W and press enter. Now let's exit out of Neovim. I'm going to do :Q and enter. I'm going to open it up again. I'm going to open a Lua file. Let's go back to this lspconfig.lua. And I'm going to do :lsp info and press enter. This will give us some information about the language servers. You'll see here that we have one client attached to this current buffer, and that's the Lua language server because we're editing a Lua file. And then here we also have a list of all of the configured servers. I'm going to press Q to close this window. Now to show you how some of these key maps work, I'm going to go down here to this onAttach function, for example, and I'm going to look for LSP references with G and capital R. That'll open up Telescope, and it'll show us the LSP references with a preview on the right hand side. To close this, I can use Ctrl+C. If I go down to one of the places where I'm using that onAttach function, so for example, down here in line 76, I'm using it, I can do GD, and that'll show me where it's defined. I can jump to it by pressing enter, and it takes me back to the definition of that function. Let's say we want to do a rename, so let's say I want to rename this onAttach function. I can do leader RN, and then that'll use the dressing plugin we configured earlier, and we can change this onAttach function to something else. So let's say we're gonna do onAttach with 2 H's, for example, and press enter. And then if I go down, you'll see that all of the locations where we were using that variable also got updated. Alright, so I've opened up an example TypeScript project to show you some more examples of using the TypeScript language server. Let's say I make a syntax error here. It'll show up as an error. I'm going to do another one down here. And you'll see that if I go up in this file, if I want to go to the next closest diagnostic, I can do closing bracket D, and then I can keep going by just using that command, and I can go backwards with opening bracket D. Let me undo that. If I use uppercase K, that'll show me documentation for what is under the cursor. If I do uppercase K again, I'll go into that. And if I'm inside the documentation, I can use Q to close it. If you don't jump into it by just moving around, it'll go away. If I use GD, that'll show me the LSP definitions. And again, this is just telescope, so you can use Ctrl+K and Ctrl+j, which we defined earlier, to navigate through them. And you can press enter to go to that file. Because that added an entry to the jump list, you can use Ctrl+O to go back. If you do G uppercase R instead, that'll show you LSP references, and you can go through them with Ctrl+K, Ctrl+J. Let's say I want to filter them, so I'm going to do export, and that'll filter to the one that has that export. And again, you can press enter to go there, and Ctrl+O to go back. Now, one thing I haven't shown you guys is using code actions. So I'm going to delete this line, and you'll see that down in the status line, it shows that I have 2 diagnostic errors. If you're wondering what I'm using for my status line, that is the Lualine plugin. To go to the closest error, I can do closing bracket D. As you can see here, because I removed the import, it can't find that name. So I want to see possible code actions for what is under the cursor. I'm going to do space CA, which is my key map, leader CA, and it'll show me available code actions through Telescope because we're using the dressing.nvim plugin, if you remember from earlier. And if I press enter here, it'll just import that back. If I go back up, you'll see that it imported it over here. So one thing I haven't shown you guys is the auto-completion. If I start typing out here Mongoose, for example, which is one of the modules I've imported, you'll see that I'm already getting some LSP recommendations here. Let's say I want to execute a method, so I'm going to do dot, and you'll see that now I get more recommendations for possible methods I can execute through Mongoose. I'm navigating through these with Ctrl+J and Ctrl+K. If the preview window doesn't fit on the screen, then you can also use Ctrl+F and Ctrl+B to scroll through it. To close the recommendations, you can use Ctrl+E. Again, these are the custom mappings that we configured earlier in the nvim-cmp plugin configuration. If instead you want to choose one of them, you can just hover over it and press enter. Alright, I'm going to remove this. Now the final thing I want to show you with the LSP functionality is the file renaming plugin that we also added. For example, up here in this line, we're doing some imports from this util/secrets file. I'm going to open the file explorer with leader EE, which is my custom key map, and I'm going to go down here to secrets. I'm going to rename this to secrets with 2S, for example. I'm going to press enter and press enter again. And because the TypeScript language server is one of the servers that supports this functionality, because not all of them do, you'll see that in the import, the secrets file gets updated to the new name. To save this change, you can do :WA to write to all of the affected files. I'm going to undo that by renaming the file again to secrets with a single S. And I'm going to do :WA. :WA stands for write all. So all this functionality should work pretty much the same for all of the different language servers that you've configured with lspconfig, as I showed you guys earlier. The only differences you might see is that some language servers support some features and others don't. Again, if you're wondering how to set up a language server for your particular language, you can take a look at the nvim-lspconfig repository, install the language servers you need with Mason, and configure them with nvim-lspconfig. Alright you guys, so that's it for this video. I'm planning on making an updated video on linting and formatting and alternatives for null-ls. Let me know in the comments section if you're interested in seeing that. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. If you did, don't forget to leave a like down below. It really helps me out. Let me know in the comments section if you have any questions or feedback for me, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more content like this from me. See you guys in the next one. Peace.